Mansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, and hopefully other podcast platforms where you might look for them. If you like them, want to hear more, please go to my Patreon page. Also under Historiansplaining, the link is in the description, and contribute anything you might be able to, even if it's just $1. So I talked last time about human prehistory, right? The process of development, migration, evolution, invention that eventually led up to the creation of urban civilization and writing, which academic historians like to take as the kind of barrier where real history begins. But as I said last time, and as I hopefully will illustrate some in this lecture, there is no clear, fast boundary between history and not history. And any reconstruction of the past always involves grappling with any sort of sources of information you can get your hands on. So I'll talk today about Pre-Columbian America, right? This term for human society, life, civilization in North and South America and the nearby islands before the arrival of Columbus, which turned out to be a tremendous cataclysmic event that disrupted the social, political processes that had been going on for centuries in these continents. When we look at pre-Columbian America, we're seeing a large section of the world that was isolated and cut off for several thousand years, more than 10,000 years, from the other major continents of Eurasia and Africa. And yet we see a lot of the same kind of developments happening in the Americas that have a lot of interesting parallels to what had already happened or was happening at the same time over in the Eastern Hemisphere, which suggests that there are certain constants or commonalities that come out of human habits, human biology, psychology, that lead towards certain similar forms. At the same time, of course, there are unique and distinctive features of American life before Columbus that, in a way, make it possible to talk about this huge variety of different societies in different environments, spread across thousands of miles and thousands of years, as some kind of coherent picture. Okay, so as I mentioned last time, people first came into the Americas from northeastern Asia, what we now call Siberia. They traveled apparently along the Pacific coast in the Arctic regions during the last ice age. And a certain population of people settled in what we now call Alaska, or along the coastline of that Bering land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, and lived there apparently for many thousands of years, maybe as long as 20,000 years, but certainly more than 10,000 years, before they then, some of them started to migrate down the coast southward into what we now know as the rest of North America. Why did it take so long? Well, transferring from one climate area to another is very difficult, okay? And this is an important fact that really shapes the whole dynamics of human life in the Americas, as opposed to Eurasia, particularly. Okay, as Jared Diamond has pointed out, and this is a very important basic observation that Diamond made, Eurasia runs mainly east-west. You have long stretches of land stretching east to west that have basically similar climates and environments. You have the Indian Ocean coast and the Mediterranean coast, where you have fairly similar climates and habitats, and people can travel and migrate back and forth and bring familiar plants and animals with them. Also, in the interior of Eurasia, you have the massive steppe lands, right, which run right from Siberia and Mongolia and China over through Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. And as certain anthropologists have pointed out, these steppes act almost like a highway, right? They're an avenue for people as well as goods, ideas, practices to move back and forth. And you can find certain, if you look at folk stories, like, for example, the Cinderella story, some version of the Cinderella story is spread all over Eurasia, right? Because knowledge, ideas like that could move back and forth. And when I talked about Europe, right, medieval Europe and the transition into the modern era, I mentioned all sorts of inventions like compasses and gunpowder and printing that moved westward from China over into Europe and had a profound impact. And then European inventions, okay, things like firearms and movable type printing, these improvements on Chinese inventions, then moved later from Europe back over into Asia. So there was this sort of wash of people and ideas back and forth. In the Americas, you do have some places where you have wide expanses running east to west, but not that much. And one of the big ones is the Amazon rainforest, which is just not an easily traversable place, regardless. Rather, North and South America mainly run north-south, right? And that means if you come up with an idea, you domesticate a plant, you come up with a hunting practice, it's only going to have a limited range in which it's useful, and then it's going to be very slow, and it might actually never travel over into other climatic zones that might be much hotter or much colder, right? So these first humans who came in to Alaska had adapted a basically Arctic coastal lifestyle based on foods like seals or shellfish that they got from the cold ocean coast, and they didn't have the skills, they didn't have the tools, the technologies to move into other climate areas. So it was a very slow kind of trickle-down process of small groups of people gradually finding new habitats, new food sources, and adapting to them, right? So the migration downward took a very long time to begin. Once it did, it seems as if it sped up a bit, and by maybe about 16,000 or so years ago, we can see people moving into all kinds of different environments up and down North and South America, right? People adapting to hunting and gathering in tropical rainforests, in high mountains, in Patagonia, in the Caribbean islands, the temperate woodlands of eastern North America. So little by little, people infiltrated and adapted to these different environments, okay? And anthropologists have estimated that there were ultimately 3 waves of people who came over the Bering Land Bridge, right? So after that first initial settlement in Alaska, there were 2 more waves that then also moved in and had to contend for resources and contend for territory with the people already here. And so what we find is that as you look at the continents, the first group was able to spread the furthest all through the American landmass. The second group was slowed down, right, and didn't make it all the way down through South America. And the third group went even less far and basically settled around the Arctic areas and are the ancestors of the people we know as Inuits. So each wave sort of penetrated less deeply into the continent because there was more competition. It seems as if the first groups of people who made their way downward from Alaska into the continents were, certainly they were hunter-gatherers, as all people in the world at that time were, and they were particularly big game hunters. Okay, they hunted mammoths, giant ground sloths, these sorts of large land animals. which then over the next few thousand years gradually went extinct, right? We don't see them anymore. And probably human hunting was one of the factors in the die-off of these huge land mammals. Another was certainly the end of the Ice Age, right, and climatic warming, which made much more of North and South America temperate, made the winters milder, melted enormous glacial masses in North America and Greenland, and rose sea levels, right? Rose sea levels to a degree that various islands were cut off from the continents, and the Bering Strait was flooded with water, and Alaska was cut off from Siberia. And basically since that time, as far as we can tell with the evidence we have, North and South America were isolated from any contact or exchange with Europe, Asia, and Africa, at least until about 1,000 years ago. And I'll get to that later. But we saw a period of certainly more than 10,000 years of isolation. The hunter-gatherer peoples who spread down through the continents, as I said, they adapted to all sorts of different environments, woodlands, plains, high mountains, especially in the Andes, and they brought with them certain, or created certain important new technologies like pyrite tools and pottery. Eventually, agriculture arose in several different places in the Americas. As I said, in the same era when agriculture was invented in the Near East and China, likewise, certain peoples invented agriculture in the Americas as well. The earliest known domestication of cultivated plants was in Central America, in the sort of area that we now know as southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, that general area. That's where the first plant domestications we know of in the Americas began. It started with bottle gourds. Okay, so in this case, it didn't actually begin with a food crop. It began with a plant that was useful technologically as a container. So it began with bottle gourds, and then soon after squash, which could be adapted and hybridized into all sorts of different varieties, including pumpkins. Both of these were domesticated somewhere around 8,000 BC. And then a while later, maize, probably around 7,000 BC. And then avocados and cotton, not long after that. And again, cotton is another example of a plant that was domesticated in both the Old World and New World, if I can use that terminology, which of course is controversial. But it was domesticated both in Eurasia and in the Americas for its usefulness as a fiber. After Central America, plants were also independently domesticated in South America. First beans, and then shortly after cassava, probably not long after the domestications of gourds and squash in Central America. Later, South Americans also domesticated chilies and coca, right? So crops that are more for taste than nutrition. Also, a while after those, potatoes and peanuts. So when we look at our plant diet today, really most of the plant foods we eat now were originally domesticated in the Americas, right? Maize, which is a major staple, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, peanuts. These are all originally American crops. And then finally, agriculture was also independently invented in eastern North America, probably more specifically in the upper Ohio Valley, around what's now Ohio, Kentucky, eastern Pennsylvania, or western Pennsylvania, I should say, an area that would also become an important center of urban civilization. Now, for a long time, anthropologists didn't know that domestication had happened independently and separately in eastern North America, and a lot of the reason was confusion over gourd seeds of a particular species called Cucurbita pepo. So Cucurbita pepo is a species of vine that has many different varieties that can grow many different sorts of gourds and squash, including pumpkins, right? So most pumpkins that we see and that we grow today are of this species, Cucurbita pepo. But there are many other varieties and strains of Cucurbita pepo that don't grow pumpkins. And when archaeologists have found stashes of Cucurbita pepo seeds in North America, it's given rise to a lot of confusion because it's very hard to tell exactly what sort of variety of seed you're looking at. It can be impossible to know. And it's hard to know whether it's a domesticated plant or a wild plant, right? So we know that people 3,000-4,000 years BC in eastern North America had collections of Cucurbita pepo seeds. And so for a long time, anthropologists found these stashes of seeds, and they assumed what this meant was that people in those regions, in the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi Valley, had gotten domesticated pumpkins from Mesoamerica, right? So, or some sort of domesticated squash from Mesoamerica. And that's how they learned about agriculture, right? And once they had these domesticated varieties, they then went on to also domesticate and cultivate other sorts of plants. More recently, anthropologists have disputed this and have actually found that there's no evidence that those Cucurbita pepo seed stashes were domesticated or that they were part of any sort of cultivation, but rather domestication and farming began in eastern North America with a plant called sumpweed, a sort of weedy grass that grows in disturbed ground, especially frequently flooded riverbanks. That was actually the first plant domesticated in eastern North America around 2500 BC, so a while after farming had been invented in Mesoamerica and South America. These eastern woodland North Americans then also domesticated sunflowers and goosefoot, and then only later adopted other domesticated crops like squash, beans, and maize from others in Mesoamerica. Okay, so eastern North America is a third independent site of domestication, and it seems to have begun with people who lived along riverbanks and at a time when the winters were becoming more mild, there was less spring flooding, and hence there was less of this sort of disturbed ground in which weedy grasses grew. People started collecting and replanting those weedy grasses for themselves so that they would still have a steady supply of them, and this gave rise eventually to to gardening and domesticated plants. Okay. So in each of these three places where domestication happened, we see eventually a big rise in population, a formation of large settled towns, and eventually cities, right? So the process happens just the same here in the Americas as it did in Eurasia and Africa, right? The domestication, large-scale farming allows for tremendous food surpluses, which makes it possible for settled large populations, specialization, and urban life. Okay, so I'll talk some about what were these large civilizations that arose in the different parts of the Americas. But first I'll again point out some important distinctive conditions of life in the Americas that shaped and in some ways limited the way civilization could develop in the Americas as opposed to the Eastern Hemisphere. As Jared Diamond and others have pointed out, there were very few domesticated animals in the Americas, right? Whereas civilization was spurred on by the domestication of goats and sheep, and then later pigs, cattle, chickens, horses, of all sorts, all kinds of useful domestic animals, animals for food, animals for labor. There were very few in the Americas, and the main reason seems to be simply there were far fewer animals of any sort that were amenable to being domesticated, right? There were no cattle, there were no boars, there were no horses. The main pack animals or animals for labor that were domesticated in the Americas eventually were llamas, right? And llamas are useful and they're good at high altitudes, and people certainly made use of them in South America. But that's about it. And it's not the same as having horses or oxen. Likewise, the megafauna that had died out basically left behind one significant survivor, which is bison, and bison really can't be domesticated in the way cattle can. Certain animals just have very different behaviors and dispositions, and it's just not possible to bring them under human control the way you can animals like cattle and horses. And in a way, it's not surprising that things shook out this way, right? Because Eurasia and Africa collectively are a much bigger landmass. There's just a bigger variety of different animals. And when one of them could be brought into domestication, that practice could then spread to other people, whereas there were just much fewer options to find in the Americas. So there's a comparative lack of animal power. Instead, human power has to be used. When you're building, when you're creating roads, when you're creating temples, you have to rely on human muscle power, right? And that requires much more effective social control of people in order to get the labor that you need, as compared to places like Egypt or China. And there was greater geographic isolation, and that's isolation not just of the Americas from the other continents, but also of regions within the Americas, right? When you look at North and South America, you see a kind of, rainbow of different climatic and biological zones, and movement among them was much less frequent. The travel of people, of technologies, of goods was a lot slower and less frequent than travel in Africa and Eurasia, which much more often could move east-west. Okay, so how did civilizations eventually arise in this kind of environment? Well, the main urban centers formed, not surprisingly, close to those three places where agriculture was invented. So firstly, in Mesoamerica, that area of southern Mexico, the Yucatan, Central America, we see an urban society first forming around 2000 BC, right? And it begins with groups called the Olmec and the Zapotec, who gradually form a series of fairly large cities and build monuments and monumental sculptures, right? You might have seen the Olmec heads from southern Mexico. Those are some of the oldest large artifacts from America, and they were created by the earliest known urban society in the Americas, going back, around 4,000 years. We don't know very much about the Olmec and the Zapotec. We don't have surviving written records. Subsequent societies didn't write or record much about them, and they were largely in tropical areas, right? So it's a lot harder to find these remnants of the Olmec in places like, the tropical rainforests of the Yucatan or Guatemala than it is to find artifacts in, say, the Great Plains, right? So even archaeologically speaking, these are very mysterious people that are hard to reconstruct. These archaic societies gradually declined, and around 200 AD, they were superseded by a new civilization called the Maya, right? And the Mayans flourished between about 200 and 900 AD. So around the same time as, say, the early Middle Ages in Europe. The Maya were a series of independent city-states all around the Yucatan Peninsula that depended on intensive cultivation of maize and squash and other crops. They built very strong, often highly militarized cities Also highly ritualized. They were great temple builders. You can still see the Mayan temples at sites all over southern Mexico. For a long time, historians and archaeologists imagine them as being a sort of idyllic, peaceful civilization, but that's not actually true. There were wars, there was brutality, and really this is true all across pre-Columbian American society, right? It can be easy sometimes for people to romanticize or imagine pre-Columbian America as a kind of Eden. It was not. It was a realm where human beings lived, and there was sometimes peace and there was sometimes war. There were great achievements, and there was often great brutality and destruction as well. But anyway, Mayan civilization, it was urban, and in certain respects, it was technologically sophisticated, right? Sophisticated engineering, mathematics. In many ways, the calculation systems used by Mayan mathematicians were more sophisticated than anyone in Europe at that time. They were very precise astronomers. A lot of the Mayan temples were also observatories where mathematicians would make observations and construct very precise and sophisticated calendars of the movements of the heavenly bodies. And the Mayan calendar that they developed in this classical era was more precise about things like the exact length of the year than the contemporary calendar used in Europe and Asia. The Mayan cities also soon went into decline, and Mayan society did not go away, but the cities were gradually abandoned, and it seems the population basically returned to small farming and hunting-gathering. The main reason for this probably was, again, climate change, that the Yucatan Peninsula was becoming more intensely wet and tropical as the medieval warm period began, and it became impossible to maintain the kind of agriculture that had supported the Mayan cities. So the cities gradually dispersed, but people continued to speak the Mayan language, to worship various Mayan deities, and there are still Mayan people today. Okay, so this is something that occasionally has surprised people when I mention this, that there are still Mayans around. They're not gone. They just aren't living in those kinds of monumental urban centers like they did 1,500 years ago. After the dissolution of the Mayans' cities after about 900, new urban societies start to arise farther to the west and northwest, right, around the sort of core area around the Valley of Mexico. Right, which makes sense when you consider that the climate had become hotter, wetter, more tropical. The ideal setting for large-scale productive agriculture was no longer the low-lying coastal flatlands. Instead, it was the cooler, more moderated uplands. Right? So after 900, you see certain cities arising among a sort of loose group of people called the Mexica, who spoke a language called Nahuatl, which also is still spoken today, right? And that's where our word Mexico comes from these Mexica people. We know that they built a large city called Teotihuacan, or City of the Gods, somewhere around 900 or a little after. And later in the 13 and 1400s, this urban growth accelerated dramatically, and we see several large cities forming in that central valley of Mexico around Lake Texcoco. Now, this, in a sense, is where a new stage of history begins, properly speaking. The Mayans had invented a form of writing. They did create inscriptions recording events, accessions and deaths of rulers, wars, mathematical knowledge, but there's not a whole lot of their writing and inscriptions remaining, right? We only have so much information from them. These Mexica cities used a bit more writing, and more of it survives. More of it is archaeologically accessible than the Mayan ruins in the Yucatan. And so we have some more clear stories from the Mexica people themselves about who they were and where they came from. Okay. The people who built the city of Tenochtitlan, whom we now call Aztecs, right? That's a name that's been attached to them that we now use, although they generally just said they were Mexica. The Aztecs said that they began from an island called Aztlan. We don't know where this island is, but maybe it once existed somewhere in Mexico, in some lake or on the coast. So they said that they originated in Aztlan, and then in the 1300s they left Aztlan and moved into a more amenable area for building large cities, so into the Central Valley of Mexico. And they founded the city of Tenochtitlan in 1327. Okay. Tenochtitlan began on a chain of small islands in Lake Texcoco. The Mexica created a system of chinampas, or sort of floating islands for intensive agriculture, right? They were master cultivators, and through this kind of floating aquatic agriculture, they were able to produce enormous surpluses, particularly of maize. Tenochtitlan grew rapidly and became a city of possibly as many as 1 million people in the mid-1400s. So it's hard to, there's no surviving census, we can't say exactly, but it certainly was a very large city, and might for a while have actually been the largest city in the world. It certainly was among the largest cities in the world, comparable to Baghdad or Constantinople or Hangzhou. It was a tremendous urban center with dense packed neighborhoods, and also with central markets and plazas, and an enormous pyramidal temple complex, similar in stylistically fairly similar to the Mayans, right? And we can see here a pattern where, as new civilizations, new cities arose, they would sort of build off of the metaphorical foundations of previous civilizations, right? The Mexica, the Aztec borrowed from the Maya and from the Olmec in sort of similar ways to the way, Europe borrowed from the Romans, right? And the Romans borrowed from the Greeks, right? We can see this kind of chain of succession of somewhat similar societies, okay? A similar process also happened in the same era in South America, right? Now, in South America, you have the large, dense Amazon rainforest, you have some coastal plains, you have grasslands in the southern cone, but the place where agriculture and urban life arose actually was the Andes, right? So the Andes, like the Central Valley of Mexico, have a lot of more kind of moderate, mild climate areas at high elevations. And furthermore, if you have a variety of different crops that you want to produce, you can plant them at varying different levels of elevation, right? So on one mountainside, you might have several different climate zones. And if you can terrace them, you can grow all sorts of different foods within those climate zones, all within, a single day's walk of one another. So this actually made it surprisingly an amenable place for large food surpluses and towns and cities, even though it's such a extremely rugged area. Certain early civilizations arose in the sort of central belt of the Andes, around what's now Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, beginning with the Chavin and the Nazca as early as 900 BC. Later, various Aymara kingdoms up through the first millennium AD. Again, we don't know a whole lot about these peoples and their empires. And after about 1000 AD, they declined and were superseded by the Incas. Okay, so similar sort of pattern where after 900 we see the Mayans superseded by the Mexica. In South America, we see these early Andean empires disintegrating and being superseded eventually by the Incas. So the Incas began as a tribe around the area of a town called Cuzco, right, which still exists in Peru. They were a fairly minor local power that started out by expanding very slowly and annexing their sort of immediate neighbors, okay? A lot like the rise of Rome in Italy. By 1400 or so, they were a flourishing regional power. They built the city of Machu Picchu as an imperial palace around 1400, right? So the real capital, the real political and economic center of the empire continued to be Cuzco, and Machu Picchu was built specifically as the estate of the emperor, who was called the Inca. This was a very monarchical, absolutist society where the emperor, called the Inca, had tremendous power and was seen as a divine figure. They then rapidly began to expand and conquer huge portions of the Andes, starting in 1442. Okay, so by the time we're looking at the mid-1400s, we have Tenochtitlan as the main political power in Mexico and this new Incan empire in the Andes. Now, at the same time, if we look outward from these two main centers of civilization, the Valley of Mexico and the Andes, we have all sorts of nomadic and sometimes semi-nomadic peoples, right? Various traveling hunter-gatherers living off of wild animals and plants, and also some increasing numbers of semi-nomadic peoples, people who might remain at certain sites for large portions of the year, might engage in some degree of gardening and farming, and who were sort of, borderline between hunting, gathering, and settled agricultural society. These peoples generally did not have, fortified urban centers, right? They only had small, usually temporary settlements. Hence, they were very vulnerable to one another. Right? It was easy for one nomadic or semi-nomadic group to pick up and suddenly attack another, right? So in order to survive, these various peoples had to develop very sophisticated diplomatic norms, right? Very sophisticated rules of interaction to avoid unnecessary conflict, right? And we can see this, we know, particularly in North America. Right, so when we look at North America between about 900 AD and 1500 AD, when Europeans start showing up, we know that these peoples had extremely complex diplomatic protocols. There was a very strong ritualized ethic of gift giving. Okay, people were absolutely expected to present diplomatic gifts when encountering representatives of other groups. There was extremely polite and formal diplomatic speech, and there was also a diplomatic sign language. Okay, since peoples around North America and the Caribbean basin spoke all sorts of different languages that were often unrelated, they needed a reliable way to communicate when they met or encountered one another. And you may have seen sometimes in movies or television, Native American diplomats and attachés acting out a sort of elaborate sign language. Well, that was the diplomatic sign language that people developed because they needed it for formalized interaction and exchange. There were also complicated practices of captivity and adoption, right? So in North America at this time, there was plenty of land and plenty of natural resources. What tended to be a bit more scarce was people, right? So if you went to war with a neighboring people, which happened sometimes, the main prize that you wanted to capture was humans, right? And you would generally take them captive, you'd take them back to your home base, and many of them you would then adopt. into your own tribe or nation. Right? So there was cross-adoption going on all the time. Many people acted as diplomats because they might have grown up in one society and then been captured and integrated into another society. However, when you went to war there and you took captives, there were usually some people that you couldn't adopt in and integrate. It was simply too difficult or too dangerous. And that was the adult male warriors. So what would you do with these people? Generally, you would kill them, and you would kill them in a very brutal way. And there's a reason for this. And we can see examples of this, many accounts of this from Europeans after Europeans came into the Americas and witnessed this happening. They would often be horrified by the tortures that Native Americans would inflict on their prisoners of war. Well, the reasoning behind it was that it was considered honorable and courageous to die in war. It was considered dishonorable and embarrassing to be captured, right? So when you tortured one of your captives before putting them to death, you were giving them a chance to show their courage and their fortitude in the face of suffering. So this was a way to give them a chance to sort of, redeem themselves and have some honor in their death, right? So we can see from oral records and from later written accounts that this kind of elaborate ethic of diplomacy, politeness, of norms of war and peace, captivity and adoption were very widespread all around the North American continent. And interestingly, a lot of them then persist in new forms in rising urban civilizations, right? We can see this, for example, among the Aztec. The Aztec would go to war. I'll talk more about this later when I get a little more into the Aztec. They would go to war and take prisoners, and they had very elaborate, formalized rules of polite interaction and diplomacy, and this would come into play when Europeans encountered them as well. Okay, so this is a sort of sketch of some of the common patterns, common features that we can see among these various different peoples outside of Mexico in the Andes. Now, as I said, Eastern North American people, particularly it seems in the Ohio Valley, also invented agriculture, and that invention of agriculture eventually gave rise to larger, more urban civilizations there as well. Firstly, the Adena society seems to have formed based on a combination of hunting, gathering, and farming. And it seems to have arisen between around 1000 and 200 BC. We don't know a lot about the Adena. We have certain surviving artifacts. We have settlement sites. And mostly what survives from that society is the mound building, right? Okay, there was the Adena built massive, often complex earthwork mounds, sometimes in the forms of serpents or other birds or other animals, where they buried their dead, and that maybe also had some ceremonial use. And if you look at them from the air today, you can see aerial pictures showing the sort of complex artistic shapes of these enormous earthwork mounds. They also created art particularly depicting animals, right? And most of what we have from the Adena and similar societies is sculptural art, effigies, statues of jaguars, birds, bears, serpents, all kinds of animals like this. And so we see a similar continuing obsession with animal forms in this ancient North American art, a lot like what we saw in prehistoric art in Europe and Asia. The Adena society went into decline around 200 BC, and shortly after, a new society arose sort of on the ruins of the Adena that's been called the Hopewell. And the Hopewell civilization adopted crops from Mesoamerica, right? So whereas the Adena knew, sumpweed and sunflowers and things like this that had been domesticated there in North America, the Hopewell adopted maize, beans, and squash, right? These highly productive, highly dependable crops that they imported from Mesoamerica. They were able to build bigger cities and bigger earthwork mounds between about 200 BC and 600 AD. The Hopewell also created depictions of humans and some portraits that seem to possibly represent human-animal combinations or humans taking on animal forms. And one example is the Ray figurine, which seems to show a shaman wearing a bear skin suit and pulling a bear mask over his or her face. And this suggests that maybe there were similar shamanic practices involving transformation into animals like what we see in Eurasia. It seems that they also were sophisticated astronomers, right? We can see an octagon-shaped earthwork in Ohio that seems to be very precisely aligned with the cycle of maximum and minimum lunar risings as seen from that point of view. So it seems that they also were very meticulous about observing and analyzing the movements of the heavenly bodies, much as the Maya were at the same time. This civilization gradually declined as well, and it seems people dispersed out of cities and into more thinly populated woodlands, giving way to what's been called the late woodland period. The sort of rhythms of life, the methods of gathering food seem to have returned back to the hunting gathering that had happened back before the Adena. This seems to be the time period when the Vikings showed up, right? So the Vikings had gradually moved by sea out of Scandinavia, sort of island hopping westward to Iceland, then Greenland, and then gradually closer to mainland North America. According to the Vikings' sagas, they settled for a time in a land called Vinland, but they soon after were attacked by local people whom they called Skrælings, or little ugly people, who forced them to abandon and retreat back to Greenland. We don't know exactly where Vinland was. Okay. We do know that Vikings definitely settled at least as far into the Americas as the northern coast of the island of Newfoundland, right, in what's now Canada. There has been a major Viking archaeological site found there called Lens au Meadow. That's its current name. We know that it was a fairly long-lasting Viking town. We don't know if they went further than that. Certainly many Viking artifacts, like coins and small tools, have been found all the way down into what's now New England. But we don't know if that means Vikings were there or if goods were traded. Recently, surveys from the air have found what seems to be possibly another Viking site on the southern coast of Newfoundland, right? So a couple hundred miles farther south down the coast of North America. This is only a sort of set of contours that might represent a small Viking town with a small enclosed harbor. But the site itself has not been fully excavated on the ground, right? So we have to hold off on any definite conclusions. When we look in the Viking sagas at descriptions of Vinland, it seems it was described as a fairly warm area, at least, as compared to Greenland and Iceland. And there are contextual clues that suggest it might have been in Nova Scotia or maybe even as far down as New England. But again, we don't know. And if there are any archaeological remains to be found, it'll be a long search. Now, why did the Viking colonization in America in the late 900s not have nearly the same impact as Columbus's landing in the Americas? Well, there are many reasons. The Vikings came with different ideas, different goals, different technologies. But it seems the most crucial difference, as the historian Alfred Crosby pointed out, is they came over without the same diseases. When the Spanish landed in the Caribbean, they were able to quickly colonize and conquer huge swaths of the Americas, largely because they brought deadly diseases like smallpox with them, to which Americans had had no exposure, right? And as I talked about before in the lecture about Columbus, Eurasia and Africa were gigantic incubators for human and animal diseases in a way that the Americas were not, right? You had generally smaller, more isolated populations. You had much fewer animals that lived in communion with human beings, and it simply did not create the same, cornucopia of viruses and bacteria that the Eastern Hemisphere societies did. So the Spanish brought all kinds of pathogens with them when they landed in the Caribbean. The Vikings apparently did not. They didn't touch off huge epidemics of disease. Why not? Because the Vikings, as I said before, had for centuries been gradually island hopping westward and settling for stretches of time in fairly isolated and cold land masses like Iceland and Greenland. And in that environment, tropical diseases died out, crowd diseases like smallpox gradually died out. You had a sort of unintentional quarantining of these fragmented Viking populations in the far north, where they simply stopped reproducing these pathogens that relied on large crowds, like influenza, smallpox, typhus, and so forth. So by the time the Vikings settled in Newfoundland, they didn't have those old world diseases with them anymore. What that meant is that if they were going to stay there, they were going to have to seriously contend with the local Americans. And it seems that these American people tolerated them for a while, but after some period of probably a few years, turned against them and drove them out. Why did this happen? Why did relations sour, so to speak? Again, we don't know, but Alfred Crosby has pointed out that according to the Viking sagas, one way of acting in a friendly manner towards the local people that the Vikings attempted was giving them milk, right? The Vikings brought cattle with them, and they offered milk. Well, there were no cattle in the Americas, and there was no exposure to dairy, and there was no ability to digest dairy, right? So these Vikings, when they met possibly hostile groups, may have offered them milk and inadvertently poisoned them and made them sick, thus eventually provoking violent retaliation. So relations were literally soured, you could say. Okay, so the Vikings end up withdrawing back to Greenland after about 1000 AD. And you get a further several centuries of isolation. Now, this late woodland period ended after 1000 AD. So basically at the same time that the Vikings retreated from Newfoundland, the climate also was warming, and we see a renewal of large-scale productive agriculture in eastern North America and more broadly in the Mississippi Basin, right, around the Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri valleys. New large cities sprung up, especially around the core of the Ohio Basin, around what's now Illinois and Missouri. And two in particular really towered above the rest that were called Kaskaskia and Cahokia. Okay, and Kaskaskia and Cahokia were sort of the possibly capitals, but certainly the apex cities of a new civilization that's simply called the Mississippian or Mound Builder civilization. They built larger and more dramatic temple mounds out of earthworks in Kaskaskia and Cahokia. So these temple mounds, many of which you can still see, are still there in Illinois and Missouri. In a sense, they're earthworks, so they build on the legacy of the Adena and the Hopewell, but they're large pyramidal temple structures. In that sense, they're similar to the Mayan and Aztec monuments, right? and it seems they supported large wooden temples. And this urban civilization, kind of revolving around Kaskaskia and Cahokia, spread all over the Mississippi Basin from what's now Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. You see similar temple mounds being built in what's now Georgia, Alabama, and all the way up in the Dakotas. There was a very extensive trade network. Mississippians traded luxury goods back and forth from the Pacific to the Atlantic and from the Arctic to Mexico. We don't know a lot about them. They didn't have writing, strictly speaking, but it seems they had a caste-based society with several classes, including a priestly caste. Your caste status was matrilineal. A person's position in society was determined by the status of their mother. They seem to have had a sun-centered religion, right? Similar, again, to what we see in both Mexico and the Andes. Okay, the sun as the central symbol of the divine and the gods. They also had ritual game playing, like the Aztecs and the Mayas. They had high-stakes, ritualized sport contests on which sometimes lives could depend, and it seems as if there may have been human sacrifice. Okay, and this is something that we know happened in the Aztec Empire, and it seems as if it might have happened among the Mississippians as well. That there are sites where it seems as if human sacrifices were buried. This Mississippian society started to decline after about 1400. The towns and cities began to shrink. Some were abandoned. Those that remained set up more and more defensive structures, possibly indicating loss of political power and increasing disorder. Again, we don't know why, but probably climate is the main root factor. Okay, remember the late medieval warm period lasted from about the 800s to the early 1400s or so. And then we see a period of climatic cooling from the 1400s and 1500s, and particularly into the 1600s. However, some remnants of some sort of Mississippian civilization did continue for long after that. We can see walled cities with temple mounds still standing in places like Georgia and Alabama at the time when the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto went through those areas, right? So there were still urban societies in those areas that were something like the Mississippians. Most particularly the Natchez, right? A nation in what's now Mississippi and Louisiana, persisted down through the 16 and even into the 1700s. And it's from inference from the Natchez people that we can infer a lot of what we know or what we theorize about the Mississippians, right? The very complex and strict caste structure of society, and a very complex agricultural system that involves the Mesoamerican crops, maize, beans, and squash, together with some gardening of the older North American crops like goosefoot. Right, and we can see, for example, French colonists in Louisiana describing the Natchez people planting goosefoot along riverbanks as a kind of emergency backup crop or a hedge in case the other crops like maize fail. Okay, so this sort of strategy of survival and this kind of structure of society seems to have persisted at least down until the French eventually destroyed the Natchez Nation in 1729. Okay, in the Caribbean, we see a large population of urban people in sort of, again, loosely allied small cities. And these people were called the Taino. Sometimes the Taino are referred to as the Arawak. You may have heard that term, but actually, technically speaking, Arawak was the language that they spoke. The people were Taino. And some of them formed sort of small urban confederations and small kingdoms in Hispaniola, Cuba, and other Caribbean islands. these Taino people, a lot like the North Americans, had, again, very complex systems of diplomacy, and they used a complicated layering of agriculture and gardening and hunting and gathering. By the time Europeans arrived, and I won't get too deeply into the European arrival, but as you know, the Caribbean is the place where Europeans eventually did land. At the time when the Europeans arrived, we see that the Taino were coming under aggressive attack from another people called the Carib. And the Carib originated in South America, in the area of sort of Venezuela, Guyana. And they were a very aggressive martial people. And they developed strategies for attacking vulnerable island populations, particularly by sending war parties on large war canoes and quickly surprise attacking island peoples. And these Carib, over the course of the 1400s, invaded and occupied a string of islands in the Lesser Antilles, right? So areas that are now St. Vincent, Dominica, Guadeloupe, those sorts of areas. And by 1492, it seems Carib war parties were beginning to raid Puerto Rico, right? So they had sort of colonized up through the Lesser Antilles and were beginning to strike the larger Caribbean islands, the Greater Antilles. The Carib were pretty frightening, and again, like so many peoples in North America, one of their main goals really was the capture of people, more than necessarily the capture of goods or land. And the Carib tended to abduct women and take them captive and, again, adopt them into their own nation. So when you look at the Carib people in the 1500s, you see differences between the men and the women, right? Because the men were overwhelmingly actually Carib, whereas many of the women had been taken from other nations, to the point that some Europeans, when they encountered the Carib, found that the men and the women spoke slightly different languages, right? Because the women had brought in so many foreign words, especially Taino words, that their language actually sounded different. So this is a little sort of overview of the different societies and civilizations that arose in Mesoamerica, in South America, in North America, and eventually in the Caribbean with the Taino and the Caribs. Okay, so these are the different societies we can see forming in these different parts of the Americas. Now, with many of them, as I said, with the Adena, the Hopewell, the Olmec and Zapotec in Mexico, we don't know very much about them, right? It's hard to find extensive archaeological remains in some places. There is not surviving writing from these peoples, and there isn't a lot of record about them from other later societies that superseded them. So the societies that we actually know the most about by far from pre-Columbian America are the two powerful militaristic empires that were still in existence and still ruling when the Europeans showed up. And those are the Aztec and the Inca, right? So I've talked a little bit about where those two empires first arose from, right? The Aztec in the Valley of Mexico, the Incas in the Andes. But I'll talk a little bit more about what we actually know about how those societies worked and how they seem to reflect or not reflect these broader patterns of pre-Columbian life. So the Aztec their empire began firstly as a confederation of 3 cities in the Valley of Mexico, or what's called the Triple Alliance. Right, Tenochtitlan was only one of the 3, although it was understood to be the senior partner, right? And this is the same pattern we see over and over again all over North America and Mesoamerica. The diplomatic coexistence of urban centers, which sometimes led to alliances and the formation of empires, right? The large populations of these cities in the Central Valley, particularly Tenochtitlan, were based on very intensive Chinampa agriculture on Lake Texcoco. They used writing to manage their laws and trade and to record political and astronomical events. They, again, had a very sophisticated calendar based on the Mayan innovations. And in the 13 and 1400s, as these cities grew, the Triple Alliance began to conquer and demand tribute from other surrounding peoples around central Mexico, right? So the Aztec, as we call this new Mexica empire based on the Triple Alliance, the Aztecs, they didn't necessarily annex surrounding peoples, but rather they subjugated them and demanded extensive tribute, and often would allow these subject peoples to maintain their own customs, their own classes, and their own leadership if they would pay these heavy tributes. So all in all, the Aztec Empire conquered around 400 distinct communities around Mexico. And in the empire, they generally recognized and reinforced class distinctions between nobles and commoners, and they managed and governed both their own Mexica subjects and their subject peoples by appointing leaders of small related kin groups called calpuli, right? And they would generally collect tribute in the form of goods or labor from these various calpuli. At the top of the social pyramid were a priestly class and also a very powerful warrior class, divided into units of eagle warriors and jaguar warriors. These would be, highly trained infantry fighters using generally bronze and obsidian weapons, and they at the same time participated in a high artistic culture. Okay, it was common for warriors who took part in wars and conquests and ritualized sports to also write poetry or create visual arts. This was sort of you might compare it kind of to the samurai class in Japan at the same time, right? Highly cultivated, artistic aristocrats who at the same time could be very brutal fighters. The Aztec conquered these various peoples around the Valley of Mexico through wars that often began from sort of diplomatic pretexts, okay? The Aztec had an extensive trading network running all around North America and Mesoamerica. They would send sort of merchant diplomats out with teams of porters to various societies. They would demand entry into these surrounding, towns and cities of different peoples, and they would demand very extensive formal respect for these kind of merchant diplomats representing the Aztec Empire. If these traders suffered any sort of insult or dishonor, that could then be used as a justification for going to war and invading and conquering these neighboring peoples, right? And this is the sort of thing we see empires do very often all through history, is, send out diplomats and then wait for something to go wrong to use as a pretext to go and attack and annex. These wars with neighboring peoples could give rise to more territorial expansion, and also the main prize that they yielded was captives, right? People, okay? And many of these wars of conquest would lead to the return of large, almost armies of captive men being marched into the capital at Tenochtitlan, where most of them would be sacrificed. Okay, The Aztecs had a solar religion centering on the sort of astronomical temples around Tenochtitlan. They believed that their rule over their empire was justified because they were priests of the sun and of the heavenly gods, and that it was their duty and responsibility to protect the world, to placate the gods, and to protect the world from the forces of darkness and chaos that threatened to destroy it. So this was their convenient justification, and as part of that, they performed many human sacrifices as offerings to the sun god and other heavenly gods. They believed that these gods had created humankind, that blood was the sun element that kept human beings alive from this sort of gift from the sun god, and that therefore it was their duty to offer blood back to the gods as a sacrifice and as a propitiatory offering to protect and preserve the world. There was also cannibalism. We know that some of these human sacrifices were eaten in whole or in part by the priests of the temple. And we have depictions from Aztec books, codices from the 1500s, that show some of this cannibalism. It's unclear, though, how extensive the cannibalism was, right? Was this just a sort of ritual act occasionally performed by priests as part of their worship, or was human flesh distributed more widely to the sort of warrior class and noble class of the empire? This is unclear, and anthropologists again have pointed out that cannibalism tends to be more common in places where there are very few domesticated animals or game, and where sources of protein are scarce. So it is possible that in an environment like the Central Valley of Mexico, there was a sort of appeal to the idea of eating human sacrifices because there were very few sources of meat. But again, we don't know how often or how extensive this practice was. So arguably, if we look at the sort of trajectory of Aztec power and politics, it seems there was possibly a peak of power in the early 1400s, right? So around 1400 and through the early 1400s, a militaristic caste of jaguar and eagle warriors really seized control of politics in Tenochtitlan and more or less reduced the emperor to a kind of secondary ceremonial role. And again, you can compare this to Tokugawa Japan, right, where the samurai class really has effective political power, and the emperor is reduced to a figurehead. This militaristic caste that controlled the empire in the early 1400s was extremely aggressive and expansionist, and really recruited large numbers of warriors, including some from lower caste backgrounds, into this sort of political military machine that basically kept the empire going on conquest, right? And extended the empire to an amazing extent, considering that there were no pack animals to move these people around. They all had to move on foot. But it seems by around 1450 or so, maybe a little later, things started to get rocky. This military caste ruling in the capital, and their sort of their servants, their cronies, their supporters, were living off of wealth that came from conquest, right? They were bringing in, jewels, gemstones, precious metals, human sacrifices from conquests in increasingly far-flung places. And this was more or less impossible to sustain. At some point, you've conquered everyone you reasonably can within walking or running distance. And if you don't have horses or oxen to carry you farther out, it becomes less and less worth it to undertake conquest missions, right? So everything that you acquired, everything that you looted from neighboring nations had to be brought back to Tenochtitlan by human power, right, on human feet. And that takes a certain amount of energy and a certain amount of calories, right? And at some point, even if you manage to conquer some faraway people and take a bunch of their wealth, you're going to have to spend all of that wealth just to get the food to feed people to carry it back. So it became increasingly expensive and simply not feasible to keep conquering and bringing goods and bringing human captives all the way back to Tenochtitlan, right? So it seems as if the empire basically reached its maximum extent. And this created a political crisis, right? So we have a period of crisis and a dramatic political shift in about the 1450s, 1460s, where this militaristic faction that had taken over the capital could no longer effectively deliver on their promises of loot and captives, right? They begin to lose legitimacy, and instead you see a new court faction take over, which is more traditional, which is royalist, and derives its authority from the sort of divine, priestly holiness of the emperor, and which wants to retrench, right? They see these increasing failures of military expeditions and trade expeditions as a sign of the Aztec losing the favor of the gods, and they kind of recommit themselves and recommit the empire and the capital to intensive worship of the gods within the bounds of the Valley of Mexico, and they increasingly turn away from these conquest missions around the outer frontiers. Okay, and the emperor who rules in the early 1500s, named Moctezuma, he's the emperor who eventually meets Cortez and the Europeans, and Moctezuma is very much a devotee of this sort of conservative, traditionalist, priestly caste that has taken over in the late 1400s and 1500s. And one historian sort of compared Moctezuma and his faction to Bourbonists as opposed to the earlier Bonapartists. So really, in some sense, we can say as a military and imperial power, the Aztecs were already in decline and already really in crisis by the time the Europeans showed up. And some have argued that this conditioned the way they responded to Europeans, right? That they did not respond immediately aggressively, but rather looked to the arrival of these mysterious people from far away as possibly a sign from the gods. And they initially received Cortez very politely and diplomatically. Okay, but that's the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs is a whole other complicated story unto itself that I won't get into. Now, by comparison, the Inca, it seems, were at the peak of their power, or maybe still on the rise at the time when the Spanish arrived. Okay, and the Inca had some commonalities with the Aztecs, but the empire was structured and governed very differently. So the Inca also had a mostly sun-centered religion and cosmology. They saw their emperor as a divine figure, even more so than the Aztecs. The Inca emperor, or the Inca as he was called, was considered a kind of god incarnate, directly connected to the power of the sun. The Inca built a very extensive empire and conquered hundreds of neighboring peoples all up and down the Andes Plateau, and they built extensive temples and fed their large government and large military on very intensive, multi-layered agriculture. So in these ways, they were a lot like the Aztec Empire. But they were more centralized and more absolutist. Okay, there wasn't the same sort of political, jockeying, it seems, in Cuzco as there was in Tenochtitlan. Okay, the emperor was in charge, and there was no factionalism allowed. They also did not treat conquered peoples according to a sort of diplomatic protocol, the way the Aztecs did. They didn't govern indirectly through local leaders or local groups. Rather, they tended to reshuffle and relocate conquered peoples, much like the Assyrian Empire did back in the ancient Near East. They would move people around in order to disrupt existing loyalties and power structures and to more quickly assimilate people into the laws and institutions of the Inca Empire, right? So it was a scrambled empire. They, like the Aztecs, they did organize people into small kin groups, which they called aylus, and they governed generally by demanding compliance with the law and demanding tribute labor, right? As opposed to goods, like the Aztecs, they demanded labor directly from subject peoples in a system that they called the mita. And mita labor was used to build a very extensive infrastructure, which helped to mitigate the problem of relying on human power for transport. So they built very extensive and well-built roads all up and down the Andes, through the mountain ranges and valleys. Many of those roads are still around and still used. And along these roads, they created a whole complicated network of interconnected temples and granaries to store food and feed the labor force. Okay. Property and goods in the empire were very carefully managed, and ownership was divided between the Inca himself, the imperial religious cult, and common lands and properties. Okay, so resources were very carefully managed, mostly from the center. And the Inca Empire seems to have been, they certainly were concerned with astronomy and the calendar, similarly to the Mayas and the Aztecs. But they were somewhat more obsessed with control of space, right? Integration and control of space more than with time, right? So the Maya and the Aztecs apparently meticulously divided history, both past and future, into cyclical periods. The Inca were more concerned with carefully, strategically mapping, dividing, and connecting their territory. The Inca did not have writing in the same sense that we're generally used to talking about. Okay, they didn't create written inscriptions in stone or characters on paper or parchment. However, they clearly needed a very sophisticated record-keeping system in order to maintain and share information about the management of the empire. I mean, there's no way you could have had such an extensive centralized empire without that. And it seems that they did that through what are called quipus, which are series of knotted strings. Many of these quipus survive, and you can see images of them if you look for them online. They're sort of various strings of different lengths and colors and sizes attached to ropes and then knotted in various patterns. We don't fully know how these quipus worked, okay, what they were recording or how. Certainly it seems some of them were simply recording numbers, right, numbers of people, but the details are murky, and some of them may have been recording some other sort of information, and we can't quite tell. Some have theorized in recent years that some of them actually do record words, right, that there are sounds and syllables recorded in some of these quipus, but nobody really knows how to read them today, so it's practically anyone's guess. What's significant about the quipus is the fact that if we go by traditional academic definitions, they're not writing, because they're not recording sentences. They're not representations of spoken language. At least it doesn't seem that way. There's nothing to indicate that as of yet. Now, as for why that means it's not writing, I don't know. I don't really see why it matters, or why record keeping somehow doesn't count or isn't as sophisticated if it's not mirroring or mimicking speech. But that is the argument many scholars make. It's not writing, and hence many will therefore say that the Inca aren't a civilization because they didn't have writing. I mean, it should be clear how kind of tenuous this line of argument is. When we see an extremely powerful state, centralized, organized, using engineering, geography to manage huge populations and huge territories, and using record keeping in order to do so, any argument of why that's not a civilization seems, to be missing the forest for the trees. So, as of the arrival of Europeans in 1492, these are your two main powerful empires in the Western Hemisphere, the Aztecs and the Incas. And possibly, as I said before, Tenochtitlan might be the biggest city in the world at that time, and if not, it was certainly among the biggest cities in the world. The Inca were among the most extensive and powerful empires in the world. We don't know how much those two societies were aware of one another. They probably didn't know a whole lot about one another. They didn't have paper or parchment, so it wasn't easy to pass messages back and forth. And knowledge had to be passed mainly orally by people actually traveling from one place to another. And as I said, there were not pack animals. People had to move by their own human power or by a boat. And the Aztec and the Inca did not have large-scale ocean-going vessels. They did have some ocean-going rafts made on balsa that they could use to travel and trade, some up and down the coasts. But it was much less extensive than the land and sea trade going on at this time in Africa and Eurasia. So although these were very impressive, powerful empires, they were comparatively pretty isolated within their own spheres. There was extensive trade within Mesoamerica, among Mesoamerican peoples, both in the Maya era and the Aztec era. There was extensive trade and travel, as I said, around North America during the Mississippian civilization. You can see certain goods like turquoise from the American Southwest being traded all the way down into Mexico and Central America. You can see salt from the Yucatan being traded northward into North America. So there were fairly extensive trade networks, but probably no single individual ever actually traveled that far. Rather, goods were passed from one trading point to another. There may have been some small contact between the Inca and the Aztecs, mainly by way of coasting trade along the Pacific. So some Incan goods may have made their way up the Pacific coast and eventually into Mexico. And we can see certain things like hairless dogs that apparently originated in Mexico and over time made their way down into South America. So there is evidence for some indirect trade and exchange. But overall, most peoples all around the Americas tended to think of themselves as belonging to particular groups, right? Nations, tribes, cities, without an overall sense of unity, right? People did not walk around saying, we're Americans or Native Americans or Indians. That was a concept that didn't exist, right? And people were not aware of the existence of Eurasia or Africa. And so generally they didn't have a concept of the Americas as a kind of unified geographic entity. There are some exceptions. For example, the Kuna people, who were a fairly sophisticated urban society, around the northern end of the Andes in sort of what's now Colombia and Panama, they did have a phrase Abya Yala, which means sort of the land of blood or mature land, which they used to refer to the entire landmass of North and South America. And in a way, it's not surprising that the Kuna had a phrase like that, considering that they were right at the isthmus connecting North and South America. They were in between the Mesoamerican civilizations to the north and the Andean civilizations to the south, and they may have been able to sort of conceptualize the great landmass and all the various peoples and societies on it as some kind of whole entity. But that was not the common way for most people to think and talk at this time. Rather, the Americas were a complicated world unto themselves, a world of many different environments and landscapes and many different peoples adapted to them in different ways. And it's really only in retrospect and through comparison that we can see some of these commonalities, right? The intensive agriculture, the confederations of cities, the sophisticated astronomy, interest in the heavenly bodies and calendars, the highly diplomatic speech and diplomatic interaction, these sort of common patterns that we see among all of these different peoples. We can see them from a distance in a way that they may not have been noticeable to people who were simply living them out and took them for granted from day to day. So thank you so much for listening. I'll probably continue this story at some point later. I'll probably talk about the European conquest of the Americas and what happened when Europeans and their animals and their germs came into contact with the American peoples. Again, these lectures are on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. If you want to hear more, I urge you to go to my Patreon page, also under Historiansplaining, and see if you can contribute anything. I'd like to keep them coming on a long-term basis, and I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.